I remember the exact moment I stopped believing it was going to happen. It was a Tuesday in February, the kind of cold that settles into Portland in a way that feels personal, like the weather has decided to take something from you specifically. Marcus was in the kitchen making pasta, and I was sitting at our dining room table staring at an email from our caseworker, Diane, that said the placement we'd been waiting on for 6 weeks had fallen through. The birth family had made a last-minute decision. The child, a 4-year-old girl named Lily, would not be coming to us. It was the third time in 14 months. I didn't cry. I had cried the first time, ugly and hard into Marcus's chest at 2 a.m, and I had cried the second time in the parking lot of a Target on a Saturday afternoon because I saw a little girl in a cart reaching up for her father's face and something inside me just broke open. But the third time I didn't cry. I just sat there with my laptop open and the smell of garlic in the air, and I thought, quietly and with devastating clarity, maybe this is not something that is going to happen for us. Marcus came to the doorway and looked at me, and he already knew. He could read my face the way people read weather. He said, "Again," and I nodded, and he came and sat beside me and didn't say anything for a long time, which is one of the things I have always loved most about him. He doesn't rush silence. He lets it be what it needs to be. We had been together for 11 years at that point. We met at a bookstore in Northwest Portland, the kind of story that sounds made up until you realize that people who love bookstores are exactly the kind of people who end up in long, quiet, reading on the couch kinds of love. He was reaching for the same James Baldwin novel I was reaching for, and we both laughed, and he said I could have it, and I said I'd been looking for it for weeks, and he said he had too, and we stood there in that aisle for 40 minutes talking about books and cities, and the kinds of things you talk about when you already sense that you're talking to someone important. We got married in 2017 in a backyard ceremony in southeast Portland with 70 people and a bluegrass band and his mother dancing in bare feet on the grass. It was one of the best days of my life. The second best day, I used to say, not knowing then what would become the first. The conversation about children had started early, maybe 2 years into our relationship, with both of us tiptoeing around it like it was fragile. We both wanted it. We both felt the weight of the wanting. We had talked through every option with the careful, researched seriousness of 2 men who had spent their whole lives being told that certain things were not available to them, and who had learned to plan meticulously for the things they actually wanted. We had talked to friends who had used surrogates. We had looked into costs, timelines, agencies, and then we had come back again and again to adoption, not because surrogacy was wrong, but because something in both of us felt pulled toward a child who already existed, a child who needed someone, maybe more than one someone. Oregon's foster-to-adopt system is not cruel, it is not malicious, but it is slow and complicated and full of heartbreak that nobody warns you about properly. You can attend every class, complete every home study, pass every background check, demonstrate financial stability and emotional readiness and a loving home, and then wait, and wait. And have the thing pulled back at the last moment, over and over, because the system is trying to serve too many needs at once with too few resources, and everyone in it is doing their imperfect best. We had been licensed for 2 years when Diane called us about Marcus. I know, same name. We thought it was funny at first, and then it became something else. Something that felt in the way things sometimes do, like a signal. His name was Marcus Holloway. He was 9 years old. He had been in the foster care system since he was 5, when he was removed from his mother's home after his third documented incident of neglect. He had been in 4 placements since then. The longest one had lasted 14 months. The most recent one had ended because the foster family had a biological child who developed a health condition that required all of their attention and resources. It was not Marcus's fault. Nothing in his file was his fault. But children who have been moved 4 times in 4 years develop a particular kind of understanding of the world, and that understanding lives in the body before it lives in the mind. Diane sent us his file on a Thursday afternoon. She prefaced it by saying, "I want to be upfront with you both. Marcus is a great kid. He is genuinely a great kid, but he has some behavioral challenges that previous placements have found difficult to manage. I don't want to oversell the situation. I want you to go in with clear eyes." We read his file together at our kitchen table that evening. I made tea. Marcus, my Marcus, I'll call him that from here on to avoid confusion, made tea, and we read in near silence, pausing occasionally to read something aloud to each other. The boy had a history of shutting down emotionally during conflict. He had a tendency to hoard food, which is a recognized trauma response in children who have experienced food insecurity. He had been flagged by 2 previous placements for aggressive behavior, though the notes from his therapist indicated that the aggression was almost always preceded by perceived abandonment cues, raised voices, closed doors, adults leaving the room during arguments. He was performing below grade level in reading, slightly above in math. He liked drawing. He liked dinosaurs. He liked the TV show Avatar, The Last Airbender, with a specific and documented intensity that made me smile when I read it. He was 9 years old, and he had been failed by every system designed to protect him, and he liked Avatar and dinosaurs, and he hadn't had a stable home since he was 5. My Marcus set down the file and looked at me across the table and said, "I think we should meet him." I said, "I think so too." The first meeting was at a neutral location, a community center in North Portland, with a room that had been decorated with the specific cheerfulness of a place trying very hard to feel safe. There were bright colors on the walls and beanbag chairs, and a basket of art supplies on a low table. Diane was there. His current foster mother, a warm woman named Patricia, was there. And Marcus, the boy, was there, sitting in a beanbag chair with his arms folded across his chest, and his eyes doing the thing that eyes do when someone has taught themselves not to look directly at hope. He was small for 9. He had a round face and close-cropped hair, and he was wearing a Portland Trail Blazers hoodie that was slightly too big for him, and he looked at us when we walked in with the careful, measuring look of a child who has learned to assess adults quickly for information about whether they are safe. My Marcus crouched down to his eye level immediately. That was the thing about my husband that I had loved since the bookstore. He understood instinctively how to make space smaller, how to make himself less imposing, how to signal with his body that he was not a threat. He said, "Hey, I'm Marcus. I heard you like Avatar." The boy looked at him, just looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, "Zuko is the best character." My Marcus said, without missing a beat, "Hard agree. His redemption arc is one of the best in television history." Something in the boy's face shifted. Not a smile, not yet, but a softening around the eyes, a slight uncrossing of the arms, the tiniest possible lowering of a wall that had been built brick by brick over 4 years of impermanent things. I sat down on the floor nearby, not too close, and said, "I'm Daniel. I'm terrible at Avatar opinions because I only watched it for the first time last month, so I'm still processing." He looked at me. "You just started watching it?" "Yeah. What episode are you on?" "I'm in the 2nd season, the one where Aang learns earthbending." He considered this with the gravity of someone evaluating a new employee. Then he said, "You need to pay attention to Toph. She's important." "Okay," I said, "I will." We sat in that room for an hour and 15 minutes. We did not talk about foster care or placement or adoption or anything that carried weight. We talked about Avatar and dinosaurs. He was particularly passionate about the argument that the Spinosaurus was underrated, and at one point he showed us a drawing he'd done that week, a detailed pencil sketch of a T-Rex that was genuinely impressive for a 9-year-old. My Marcus studied it with real attention and said, "You drew this?" And the boy said, "Yeah," in the tone of someone trying not to seem proud, but being proud anyway. When we left, I sat in the car in the parking lot and I said, "Marcus." My husband said, "I know." I said, "We have to try." He said, "I know." We went home and called Diane that evening and said we wanted to move forward. What followed was a process that I will describe as careful and deliberate rather than fast, because the system is not designed to be fast, and in this case I think that was right. There were more meetings. There were supervised visits at the community center, then at our house, then an overnight, then a weekend. At every stage we were watching him and he was watching us, both parties performing a kind of slow and cautious negotiation of trust. The overnight was the first real test. He arrived on a Friday evening with a backpack and a rolling suitcase, and Patricia, who hugged him in the driveway and told him she'd see him Sunday, and who I could tell was trying very hard not to show the emotion on her face as she drove away. He stood on our front porch with his suitcase and looked at the house and then looked at us, and I could see the calculation happening in real time, the assessment of risk, the measurement of exits, the old and exhausting work of figuring out whether a new place was safe. My Marcus said, "You hungry? We made chili." He said, "What kind?" "Beef, but we have cornbread too." A pause. "Okay." That first night was careful and quiet. He ate 2 bowls of chili, which I noted and didn't comment on. He watched an episode of Avatar on our couch with both of us, positioned slightly closer to my Marcus than to me, which made complete sense and which I did not take personally. He brushed his teeth and we showed him the room we'd prepared. We had asked Patricia what colors he liked and she'd said blue and green, so the room was a deep teal with bookshelves and a desk and a dinosaur poster we'd ordered online, and he stood in the doorway of that room for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "This is my room." My Marcus said, "For the weekend, and hopefully longer if everything feels okay to you. He walked in slowly, looked at the bookshelf, ran his hand along the desk, looked at the dinosaur poster. Then he put his backpack down on the bed, carefully, deliberately, like he was making a decision, and said, "Okay." He woke up at 3 a.m. the first night. I heard him before I saw him, a small sound from the hallway, barely anything. I got up and found him standing outside his room in the dark in his socks, and I crouched down and said quietly, "Hey, you okay?" He looked at me. "I had a bad dream." "Do you want to talk about it?" "No." "Okay, you want some water?" "Yeah." We sat in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, and I got him a glass of water, and I got myself one too, and we sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house, and after a while he said, "Do you have a dog?" I said, "We don't. Do you like dogs?" "Yeah. We've been thinking about getting one." He looked at his water glass. "Patricia had a dog, a yellow one, Biscuit." "Did you like Biscuit?" "Yeah." A pause. "He slept on my bed sometimes." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "If we got a dog, you could name it, if you wanted." He looked up at me, and in the low light of the kitchen, I could see the careful way he held his face, the way children do who have learned that wanting things too openly leads to loss. He said, "Maybe." I said, "Okay, maybe." We sat together until he was ready to go back to bed, which took about 20 minutes, and then I walked him to his room, and he got under his covers, and I said good night, and he said good night, and I went back to my room and lay down beside my husband who was awake and waiting, and I said, "He had a bad dream." Marcus said, "Is he okay?" "Yeah, he's okay." We lay there in the dark for a while, then Marcus said, "Daniel." I said, "I know." 3 months later, Marcus Holloway moved into our house permanently as a pre-adoptive placement. I would like to tell you that from that day forward everything was beautiful and manageable, and that love solved everything, but that would be a lie, and I promised myself when I started telling this story that I wouldn't lie. The first 3 months were the hardest 3 months of my life, including the year my father had his stroke, including the period after my last job loss, including the 14 months of failed placements that had almost broken me. Nothing in the foster care training classes, nothing in the books we had read, nothing in any conversation with any parent had fully prepared us for what it actually felt like to parent a traumatized child. He tested us constantly and creatively, and with a thoroughness that I came to understand eventually was not manipulation but survival. Children who have been moved from home to home develop behavioral patterns designed on some unconscious level to locate the point at which an adult will abandon them, because knowing where that point is feels safer than not knowing. If he could find the limit, he could prepare for it. If he could predict the rejection, it would hurt less than being surprised by it. He threw a plate once early on. Not at anyone, he was alone in the kitchen, and he was angry about something that had happened at school, and I heard the sound and came in and found him standing there with his chest heaving and the plate in pieces on the tile. He looked at me with the specific expression of someone waiting for the consequence that proves them right. I stood there for a moment. I said, "Are you hurt?" He stared at me. "What? Are you hurt? Did any of it hit you?" He shook his head slowly. I said, "Okay, good." I went to the closet and got the broom. I came back and handed it to him and said, "Let's clean it up together." He stood frozen for a moment, then he took the broom. We cleaned it up together without another word. Later that night, I sat in our bedroom and shook for about 10 minutes, because I had been terrified in that moment and had not wanted to show it, not because I was afraid of him, but because I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, of being the next adult who confirmed what he had been quietly told by every circumstance of his life, that he was too much, that he was the problem, that love came with conditions he could not consistently meet. My Marcus and I had a therapist we were seeing together, which I recommend to any couple going through this process the way I recommend oxygen. Dr. Anita Reeves, who had worked with foster and adoptive families for 20 years and who had the kind of steady, seeing presence that made me feel, every Thursday evening in her office, that we were not drowning, even on the weeks when we absolutely were. She helped us understand the plate incident not as a behavioral crisis, but as a test that we had, in her words, passed. We had responded with connection instead of punishment. We had stayed. She said that to us a lot. You stayed, as if staying itself was the primary act, as if the most important thing we could do, over and over, in 100 small ways every day, was simply not leave. His school situation required attention. He was behind in reading, and we worked with his teacher, a patient and experienced woman named Ms. Okafor who had clearly seen a lot, and who understood exactly what kind of child she had in her classroom, to set up tutoring twice a week. My Marcus took the reading sessions at home because he has more patience than I do, or a different kind of patience, and I would come home from work some evenings to find the two of them on the couch with a book between them, the boy reading aloud with the slow, careful effort of someone building a new skill, my Marcus listening without rushing him. That image, that specific image, I carry it with me. The food hoarding took the longest to address. We found crackers under his mattress 3 months in, granola bars in the back of his desk drawer, a half-eaten bag of pretzels in his closet. When I discovered the crackers, I sat on the edge of his bed for a long time thinking about what it meant that a child had felt he needed to hide food in a place where food was always available, where there was always enough, where no one had ever told him he couldn't eat. The hiding wasn't about distrust of us specifically. It was older than us. It was laid down in his body at 5 years old, and it would take time and consistency and safety, repeated over and over, to slowly loosen. We didn't address it directly at first. Dr. Reeves suggested we create a snack basket in his room, an openly available, always stocked basket of snacks that was his, that nobody would touch or remove or comment on. We explained it to him casually, matter-of-factly, as something that was just going to be part of his room. He looked at the basket for a long time the day we put it there and didn't say anything. Over the next several weeks, the hidden food slowly disappeared. We got the dog in October. A yellow lab mix, 8 months old, from a rescue organization in Beaverton. We brought him home on a Saturday morning, and Marcus, the boy, was waiting on the front steps when we pulled into the driveway. He'd known we were getting a dog that day. He'd been up since 6. The dog came out of the back seat and immediately went for the boy with the joyful, uncoordinated enthusiasm of a young lab who had not yet learned that personal space was a concept. And the boy laughed, a real, full, startled laugh that I had not heard from him in the 5 months he'd been with us, and sat down on the grass and let the dog climb all over him. He named the dog Bruno. Bruno slept on his bed every night from the first week. There is a particular moment that I have thought about more than almost any other moment in this story, and it happened on a Sunday in November, about 6 months into the placement. The 3 of us were in the backyard raking leaves, one of those grey, still Portland fall afternoons where the light is low and flat and everything smells like wood smoke and wet earth. Marcus had his earbuds in, listening to something, doing his section of the yard with focused effort. Bruno was racing back and forth through the piles we'd made. My Marcus and I were talking about nothing in particular, just moving through the afternoon together, and at some point, the boy pulled out one earbud and walked over to where I was raking and without preamble said, "Do you ever wish you had a real kid?" I stopped raking, I looked at him, he was looking at the ground. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Like a baby, like one that was yours from the beginning." I crouched down so we were at eye level, and I waited until he looked at me. I said, "You are mine, you are ours, that's not a lesser thing because it started later. It's not a substitute for something else, this is the thing." He looked at me for a long moment. I could see him processing it, turning it over, checking it for cracks. Then he said, "Okay." And he put his earbud back in and went back to raking. I stood up and looked at my husband across the yard, and my husband was looking at me, and neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. The adoption finalization date was set for March 14th. A judge, a courtroom, the good kind of paperwork. Diane was there. Patricia was there, which meant everything to us because she had loved this boy in the 14 months he'd been in her care and she deserved to see this. Dr. Reeves was there, a handful of close friends. My mother, who had cried at the phone when we called her, ugly and joyful, the kind of crying that comes from a place of profound relief. The boy wore a button-down shirt that he'd picked out himself, and which he kept tugging at the collar of throughout the morning, and when the judge asked him if he understood what was happening today and what it meant, he said yes, he understood. The judge said, "And how do you feel about it?" There was a pause. I watched him think. I watched him search for the right word with the serious, considered effort of a child who chooses his words carefully, because he has learned that words, like everything else, need to be conserved. Then he said, "Permanent." The judge smiled, the room shifted. My mother put her hand over her mouth. The judge said, "That's exactly right, that's exactly what it is." I'm not going to pretend that adoption finalization is the end of anything. It is a beginning, a legal and emotional and practical beginning that launches you into the ongoing work of family, which is the same ongoing work for everyone, complicated and imperfect and daily. Marcus is 10 now, nearly 11. He is still in therapy, which is not a sign that something is broken but a sign that we are paying attention. His reading has caught up significantly. He is obsessed with basketball and has recently added marine biology to the dinosaur obsession, which means our house is now full of books about ancient reptiles and books about deep-sea creatures, and he will tell you at length about both if you let him. Bruno is enormous and sleeps across the foot of his bed every night. He called us both Dad for the first time in January, about 3 weeks before the finalization date. Not in a big moment, not in a conversation about it, just in passing, coming down the stairs in the morning, saying, "Dad, have you seen my other shoe?" to my Marcus, and then turning to me with the shoe question before catching himself and looking, briefly, uncertain. I said, "I haven't seen it, but check by the back door." It was there, by the back door. He went and got it and came back through the kitchen, and I was making coffee, and he looked at me and said, quietly, "Is that okay, that I called you that?" I said, "That's more than okay, that's the whole thing." He nodded, went upstairs to finish getting ready. I stood at the coffee maker for a while with my eyes stinging. There are things nobody tells you when you start this process. They tell you it's hard, and it is. They tell you it takes time, and it does. They tell you to have realistic expectations and to prepare for behavioral challenges and to maintain structure and consistency, and all of that is true and necessary and important. But nobody tells you about the particular quality of love that grows in this specific way, not the sudden overwhelming flood of a birth, but a slow, accumulating thing, built from 10,000 small moments, from 3 a.m. water glasses and dinosaur conversations and raked leaves and plates swept up together from the kitchen floor. Nobody tells you how those moments stack up until one day you realize that somewhere along the way you stopped seeing a child the system had labeled difficult and started seeing just your son. Nobody tells you that the child the state said nobody wanted would become, without any dramatic announcement, the person you reorganize your entire understanding of love around. Last week he asked me if we could go to the Natural History Museum in Seattle sometime because they have a new marine exhibit and also a dinosaur hall, and I said yes, we could do that, we could plan a trip. He said, "This summer," and I said yes, this summer. He said, "Can Bruno come?" And I said Bruno would probably have to stay home with Grandma, but we'd make it up to him. He accepted this with the reasonable resignation of someone who has learned that some things cannot be arranged, and that that's okay. "Okay," he said, "but we should go for at least 2 days. There's a lot to see." I said, 2 days, deal." He put out his hand and I shook it formally, and he went back to his book. I stood there in the living room of our house in Portland on an ordinary evening, with Bruno at my feet and my husband making something in the kitchen and my son reading on the couch, and I thought about the February night I had sat at this same table and read an email about a failed placement and believed, quietly and completely, that this was not something that was going to happen for us. I thought about how many things I was wrong about. I thought about how permanent is not a limit, but a flaw, the thing everything else gets to stand on. I sat down in my chair and opened my book, and my son didn't look up, but his foot, without any apparent thought or intention, moved until it was resting gently against my leg.